Okay, want to welcome everyone to our first installment of my goodness, probably the rest of this year and maybe next year before we get all done with this. But we're going to start off with the book of First Samuel, and then we'll slide on into Second Samuel. But what this is going to be will be a course of tracing Israel's history from just right after Judges all the way through, and will possibly end at the destruction of the first temple, and then after that I'll kind of restructure it a little bit, and we'll talk about the time in Babylon, and basically the silent years there, and some of the things that so glad to be back this week. Last week we had the conference over in San Antonio with Yeshiva Shuvu, the yeshiva to which I belong, and it was very good, very interesting, and we just had a good time with it, with it all, and tried. Yeah, I got to try some of San Antonio's barbecue over there instead of the Mexican food. I was wanting to do Mexican food, but the rabbi that I was with says, "No, I came all the way to Texas. I want to try barbecue." So, okay, so we went and got brisket, and that was good too. All right. Wanted to start out with kind of a placing of where we are in history on this. Now, before we get going on here, are there any leftover questions or comments or anything from last week, or last the last series of things we did on the book of Judges? Are there anything that anybody wanted to comment on or say about Judges? Because I'm going to hit a little bit on it just tonight. All right. So, and if you do, you know the rules. If you got a comment anywhere in here, just unmute yourself and just speak out, and we'll just have a good time. All right. So what I did here was look at the on this timeline here. Can everyone see the timeline? Does it show up well for you? You can read it. Okay. There are some of those things out there that are just so out of whack that I'm not even going to bring those out for your consideration, because I think that they're way out of line. But one thing I did want to, the last time we got together, we talked about, you remember the last few episodes in Judges was the story of the concubine that was the Levite's concubine that was brutally murdered, and then he sent her body parts all over Israel, and then they got together and they fought a war against the tribe of Benjamin, and all of that kind of stuff, and it was kind of a mess. And so it comes at the end of Judges. However, guess what? That's actually is one of the very first things that happens chronologically in Judges. And we didn't do a chronological study of Judges. I just went through it from the biblical, 1 to 25 on the or 21 on the chapters. But if you look up here, about the same year that Joshua did his farewell address, and then he went on to be with his fathers, we see that this time here we talk about Micah's idolatry. The story of the Levite that basically hired himself out to be a priest to a rich guy, and he stole his mother's idols so that he'd have something to show, and so it was just kind of an idolatry or apostasy, actually. And that happened right there when Joshua died. And so Israel was already at that point in time, uh, they were in idolatry, apostasy. They had already turned themselves away from God, and that's why we look at Joshua's farewell address then and say, "Oh, now that's why he was saying, well, you choose who you're going to serve. Are you going to serve those gods that were back in Egypt, or the gods that you've encountered here in Canaan, or are you going to serve the one true God?" Now, so that's why that really brings it all into focus. Why he felt like he needed to do something like that, and so we see the story of the Levites of idolatry, and um, then this story of the concubine who is murdered, and so forth and so on. So that takes place in 1375, and so then if you were to count down to the birth of Samuel, that would have been basically um, to what from 1375 to 1375 years. From 1300 to 1200 is another 100 years, 107. So it's 275 years from the time of Joshua's death to the birth of Samuel. So we see that this period of Judges was about 275 years. And that's why you remember that they were so concerned about the Benjamites losing all of their women, and there's only 600 Benjamites left in all of Benjamin's territory, and so that's why they had to come up with this scheme of getting wives for the Benjamites, um, so that the tribe would not be lost. And then we see later on then um, that the first king of Israel was indeed a Benjamite. And so they had had 275 years then to recover from that, to the point that that the first king of Israel actually did come from the tribe of Benjamin. So that's what why this timeline is so important to understand where these events took place, so that it makes sense in the whole scheme of things. Because you certainly couldn't have a king coming from Benjamin when they only had 600 dudes to begin with, and they were trying to, if you took the story of the defeat of the tribe of Benjamin um, as being right before then Samuel comes on the scene. So anyway, that's where we are tonight. Then, and you can see, I will, when I post my notes after the class, I have a reference that I will put out there, internet references and so forth, so that you can actually go back in and see this entire. It's a several page biblical timeline. I thought it was really good. One of the better ones that I've seen, that outlines, but it just goes on and on and on for several pages of this timeline. All right, so where are we talking about? Okay, and I apologize for the way that this is showing here, because I used a different format and it was not cooperating with me very well. But I'll clean it up before next week. I didn't realize that it was going to show like that. Israel in the time of Samuel is what it's supposed to say. But you'll see in this map here where we're going to be talking about today. A lot of the action takes place in Shiloh if you're here in Texas, or Shiloh if you're someplace else perhaps. But this is where the Ark of the Covenant was. This is where the Mishkan was at that time. And then this town right here, Ramatham Zophim, easy for you to say, Arimathea. Okay, you remember the guy that they borrowed his tomb in Jerusalem. That was Joseph of Arimathea. That was where he was from. This town right here, and but that's where also Samuel's mother and father lived. All right, and we don't know who the author of Samuel is. Now, traditionally, they just say, well, it was Samuel from the chapters of 1 to 25 or 1 to 24. We really don't know, because it's never said in the book of Samuel who the author was, and you just have to pick up hints from other places, and the sages, the rabbis, had pointed us to the first 24 verses, 25 verses of Samuel are written by Samuel himself, and then the prophets Nathan and Gad are, they're the ones that contributed, a major part of that to the rest of the books of Samuel. Now, the book of Samuel originally was just one book. When it was first put out, it was just one book, and then when the Septuagint was written, and at that point they kind of split it up, and they actually called it I think the first or second book of Kings or something like that. But it's now it's come to be the book of Samuel, because he was pretty much the major character, or the character that was right there along all of the the most continuous character there. Okay, so and then we got the prophet Samuel. He was born around somewhere between, some of the people that I looked at, they said 1100 BCE, others say 1105, and they both had their reasons, and says, oh yeah, when you count this to that, it's just obvious that he was born at this date. Well, and then the other guy says, well, everybody knows that he was born on this date. So I don't remember when he was born. I wasn't around then, so I just told it the dates were between 1105 and 1100 BCE. And the main characters in the book of Samuel, all the way through both books, is Samuel himself. He was the last judge of Israel, and he was also the first prophet of Israel. Prophets being the ones who were the spokesman from God during the monarchies. When there was they shifted over to kings, then the character that spoke to the king and to the people for God was called a prophet. And remember that the work of a prophet, a lot of times you'll say, well, that guy is a prophet, or he was a prophet, and you get in your mind that it was a person who spoke or foretold the future. But if you'll look in the Bible, in the books of the prophets, you will see that probably 90% of what they said was not foretelling, it was forthtelling. By what I mean by that is that they would speak the word of God. They would tell the children of Israel. They would tell Israel and the tribes, the nation of Israel. They would tell them what was in God's word, what God was telling them about what they should be doing, and not necessarily things in the future, but reminding them of what God's word was, and what their conduct and behavior should be right at that time, based on the law that God had given them. So That's why we say he was a prophet. Now, and then we will go on and we'll see that the very first king was Saul, who Shaul, and he was from the tribe of Benjamin, and they, one of his characteristics, they liked him because he was big and he was tall. He stood up a head and shoulders above everybody else, and so they liked the idea that here Saul could lead them into battle, and he was a bigger man, taller, and so forth. To me, that would be just he was a bigger target. Everybody could say, "Oh yeah, let's take out the tall dude." And then after that, of course, Saul lost his dynasty because of his sin, and David became the great king of Israel. And as time goes on here in this course, I want to bring to you some of the archaeological evidence that these guys actually did exist, and that there was a city of David, there was a King David, and so forth, so that we have some evidence. And I'm one of these kind of guys that reads this. I don't know if you can read that, if it's backwards or not, but for me, I'm looking at it and I can read it. So hopefully you can too. Biblical archaeology review, really nerdy stuff for the most part, but every once in a while you find something that's really interesting. But anyway, I enjoyed digging over in Israel, going into the archaeological digs and finding stuff. It was great. All right. Any questions so far that we've gotten so far in here with the introduction, kind of an introduction into Samuel? Are there any misconceptions or that you thought, well, I didn't know that or didn't realize that? Anything?
Steve,
Yeah.
what was the role between the Kohen Gadol and the prophet?
Well, the high priest, the Kohen Hagadol, was he performed the necessary liturgical and the sacrificial things of the um, in the temple or in the tabernacle, and also as such, he at this point they would still go to the high priest when they had decisions to make. Remember, the high priest had the Urim and Thummim, and they would with those two stones they could make decisions. But the prophets were more of a supernumerary, that or a something beyond the normal setup of the temple and the sacrificial system, so that they could possibly do things and go places, because the high priest was pretty well restricted to wherever the Ark of the Covenant was, wherever the Mishkan was. However, the prophets could go anywhere and do anything. They were not tied down geographically to where the Mishkan was, whereas the high priest was pretty much stuck there where the tabernacle would have been. So that's why there were both. That's a good question. That really I'd never really thought about it that much. But in God's perfect plan, the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest, would have been the man that would have been leading Israel, because then it would be a theocracy rather than a monarchy type of system. And so that God's word and his leading would come from the high priest. But going along with the idea of day, or the culture of the day, the high priest was not a warrior, and the people wanted a warrior to lead them into battle. And you look through the 275 years of the book of Judges, most of the judges were called upon because they were given a call for military service, and they led. You look at the various judges. Well, Samson was one, and Othniel was another, and Jephthah, and so forth. They were called to lead Israel into battle. And the high priest, of course, was not by the nature of his office, for him to go around killing people would not have been good. So you notice that at the end of Judges, what was the last verse in the book of Judges, was that there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And you saw that the same theme said over and over again throughout the book of Judges, that every man did what was right in his own eyes, and they would sometimes say it with, and there was no king. So during the time of Joshua, when he was alive, they had a high priest who was Pinchas, the grandson of Aaron, and it worked out just fine because they had a strong military leader that the tribes coalesced around. But that was something that was, we saw in later years, where the judges, when you'd find someone that the troops would rally around, they ended up getting kind of the feeling of a monarchy, and that they would lead people, but then they started gathering to themselves a lot of wives and wealth and riches and that sort of thing, kind of contrary to what God wanted for their military leaders. And so it was kind of a mess. So that's one reason why that it shifted over into a monarchy. And that was part of, God said, even Moses had prophesied, and when you do come into the point of getting a monarch, a king, then it was already prophesied that Israel would do that. And it fell kind of in line with all the other nations of the world and how they operated, just to because Israel was not per se, well, the idea of a theocracy was very difficult for them. Let's just say it that way. And their thought was, well, if we had a king, it would all be better. And it, in some ways, maybe it was. In some ways, maybe it wasn't. So, anyway, all right. Any other questions?
I was always wondering why Samuel, who was never a Levite, how he was allowed to do animal sacrifices, but Saul, for example, absolutely was condemned for it.
Okay, well, I'm going to answer that question in just the next few minutes for you, Carl. All right, that's a good question, and let me answer it this way. All right, in the first verse, now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim in the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. All right. Now, he had two wives. The name of the one was Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. All right. Therefore, when we get into this, now, Elkanah, the father of Samuel, actually was a Levite. It says later on in First Chronicles, talks about the lineage of Elkanah. and he was a Levite who lived in the area of Ephraim. And you remember that Levites lived all throughout Israel. They did not just congregate there at Shiloh or Jerusalem, but they lived in, remember they had the 6 Levitical cities, but then they also lived scattered around because they provided the administration, and they were the educated ones. They provide the administration. They had provided adjudication of cases, the civil authority. They were kind of the civil authority in a lot of places. So when they talk about Elkanah being an Ephraimite, he was an Ephraimite in the sense that he was living in Ephraim, and had evidently been living in Ephraim for many years, possibly generations. And so the idea that I understand where you're getting from, that he was an Ephraimite. So how could Samuel then do priestly things? But the truth is that later on in Chronicles, First Chronicles, and I have to pull it up because I'm drawing a blank as to the scripture verse that talks about it. It said that they're listing the genealogy of Samuel, and in that they said that it traces it back to Levitical roots. Okay, so that is a very, very common thinking, is that Samuel was not a Levite, but he was definitely from the tribe of Levi. Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Going on with this, we explained that the idea that Elkanah was a Levite, therefore Samuel would have been a Levite. And so therefore, I mean, it just was almost a natural that he would have been in the temple and in the service of the Lord. And it's kind of interesting in that, for God to pick Samuel as he was going to be the last judge, but he was also looking forward in this whole scheme of things, because he was a Levite that and a priest. Then he could fill in, even though he never filled in the role as like a high priest, because perhaps I'd have to look at the. I don't believe he was from the lineage of Aaron, so that he would have been one of the other 3 brothers, and so he wasn't a Cohen, he was a Levite. And I'll explore that a little bit more. I'll nail that down before next week, and hopefully give you a better answer than that. But that's what I got for right now. Okay, Carl. So just bear with me, and I'll get you even a better answer for next week. Okay. We note here that that he had 2 wives. Now, while that was allowed, it was not the norm as such, and really it was ill-advised, and not these stories that you see, these reality show stories that you see today, that talks about the we 3 or what, I don't even know. There was some kind of a deal that talked about these relationships, one guy and a couple of wives, and so on and so forth. It just doesn't work out all that well. And, we have some good biblical examples of that. And we'll talk about them in a minute, but, possibly the reason that he married Peninnah was because maybe Hannah was barren and he wanted sons. He wanted an heir. And so he married Peninnah, who was not barren, and she did bear him some children. And so Let's go ahead with the next verses and we might see some more. Now, this man used to go up to this town every year to worship and sacrifice to Adonai Tzvaot in Shiloh. The two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were Kohanim of Adonai there. A sentence that that little parenthetical there has no bearing to the story right now. So, but then on the designated day, Elkanah would sacrifice and give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved Hannah, even though Adonai had kept her from having children. All right. Now, some kind of interesting stuff there. Now, the Shiloh was where the Mishkan and the Ark of the Covenant was. I told you that already. And so this was an area kind of, halfway within the population of where, it was kind of centrally located, convenient, or as, relatively speaking, with all of Israel. And, the men were required to go up to where the ark was 3 times a year, that being Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And so the story here is that this Elkanah would come up to Shiloh, offer sacrifices and so forth. Now, the sacrifice that he was giving, it was probably a peace offering or fellowship offering, because they talked about eating it with, that he was able to eat it. Now, because generally speaking, if you remember, if you offer a fellowship offering, part of it is put onto the altar and burned up, but then they take the other parts of it and they give to the priests, and they share with the priest, but it's also sharing with the family. You bring in your family and all of you eat with the priest. And so that's one of the reasons that they talk about that if you, and you were, it was also a way of the poor people who didn't have anything to have them to be able to eat, because you're supposed to invite other people in to eat your sacrifice. You bring in a big old bull, and that's a lot of meat. If let's say, generally speaking, if you got a bull and you slaughter it, it's going to run anywhere from about 55% to maybe a little higher, 55 to 60% of the bull will be edible. The rest of it is not edible. And so still, if you got a 2,000 pound bull and you have 65% of it that you can eat, that's 1,300 pounds that, you got to get rid of. You got to eat. How are you going to eat that in one day? So, and I don't know if the bulls were that big, even if they were 1,000 pounds, then that's still 650 pounds of meat that you would get rid of. So you were supposed to invite the poor people to come in and eat at that time. And so later on in the Bible, it talks about it. And when you do that, you're supposed to eat everything that day. And if you can't, then, you can keep it till the next day, but you certainly cannot keep it till the 3rd day. And the reason for that was there was no refrigeration, no way of preserving this stuff. And so if you ate it on the 3rd day, you're liable to catch cooties, and it would not end well for you. So going back to any comments or questions on that that may or may not confuse you. I don't know. Any comments on that? Okay. The sacrifice was, like I said, is probably a peace offering, or what they call a fellowship offering. And now, what's interesting here, I was looking at several translations of this part about where Hannah received a double portion. Now, in the Tree of Life version, which we've always been using. And I this week I am going to call the people that put out Tree of Life because I know them. I'm going to call them on it and ask them, okay, why did you say this? Because I've changed it around just a little bit, because all the other translations say that he gave Hannah a double portion because he loved Hannah. Makes sense. Or he gave her, there's some other wording, but basically to Peninnah and all of her sons and daughters, he gave portions. But to Hannah, he gave her a special portion or a double portion or something like that. But in the Tree of Life version, they said that, but to Hannah, he only gave one helping or one portion, and he loved Hannah, even though God had made her barren. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And when I checked all the other translations of this that I have, or at least a half a dozen, I quitted a half a dozen. They all said that he gave her a double portion or an additional portion somehow. She got more than Peninnah did. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. And when I discovered that, it's already the weekend, and so I said, well, all right, I'm going to call those dudes in Georgia and ask them why they did that. All right, so we talk about the tabernacle being at Shiloh, and this is this is where it was in Shiloh. They've pretty well nailed down where it really was, and so these are the outlines of it, where that it's lined out there, and they've done archaeological stuff and figured out exactly where it would be, but so this is the area where they would have come into that. Okay, and so I just thought that was kind of interesting. All right, now, why do you not have two wives? All right, in verse 6, her rival would taunt her bitterly to provoke her because Adonai had closed her womb. So it was year after year, whenever she went up to the house of Adonai, that she would provoke her. And so she wept and would not eat. So, her and the she's, you got to keep in mind, okay, who are we talking about here? So Hannah she wept and would not eat. Then her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you crying? Why won't you eat? Why is your heart so sad? Am I not better than 10 sons? After eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah got up. Now Eli the Kohen was sitting on his seat by the doorpost of the temple of Adonai. While her soul was bitter, she prayed to Adonai and wept. Okay, let's look at this. Okay, so you got two wives. Okay, right there, there's going to be conflict, no matter what you say. It's just a fact of life. You get two women living under the same household for any length of time, there's going to be some conflict. And same with a lot of dudes, a lot of men. If you put them together for any length of time, maybe there's going to be some conflict. But certainly, just the nature of things, women are going to, that's their home. No, it's my home. No, it's my home. That sort of thing. That sounds terribly misogynistic, doesn't it? Okay, I should stop right there and not say any more about that. But just say it this: they did quarrel, and Peninnah was, she did a lot of the nanny boo boo stuff, and taunting Hannah, and of course, Hannah got her feelings hurt, and rightfully so, because she could not help being barren. But back in those days, being barren was that was about the worst that could happen to you. And her husband, sometimes you think this guy's clueless. He asked her, why are you crying? Aren't I good enough for you? And that would not erase the stigma of not having children. I mean, that's just a given, that she was not having children. And so no matter how good he was to her, if she didn't have children, then she was not a woman. She was not, you know, she was not what she was supposed to be. And so they've gone down to Shiloh to do their sacrifices and so forth. And she got up, and then it says, now, as again, it's kind of a parenthetical there. Now Eli, the Kohen, was sitting at the on his seat by the doorpost of the temple of Adonai. While her soul was bitter, she prayed to Adonai and wept. Now, we saw that, and I just want to mention that we saw the same rivalry in Abraham's and Jacob's families, where Abraham between Sarah and okay, somebody help me out. I'm having a senior moment. The Egyptian woman that hey guy. Okay, yeah, that's what happens when you get old and you get a senior moment. Okay, between them, they fought bitterly, and then in Jacob's family, with Rachel and Leah, they were not the best of friends, even if they were sisters. So, what about that? Is it a sin to marry sisters? Anybody know? Was it a sin for Jacob to marry sisters? Da, 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 da. All right, no, it was not a sin, because why? Torah had not been given yet, and it was in Torah where it says you cannot marry your sister. So the idea that Abraham married a half sister, and then Jacob married two sisters, and so in the Torah, then God codified it and said, not a good idea. Don't do that stuff anymore. And so now, fortunately, now here for Elkanah, Hannah and Peninnah were not sisters, so he didn't violate the law. The law does not say that you can't have two wives. It's just that God's perfect plan for it is you only have one wife. All right. So Hannah, though, she knew where to go for help, and so she went to, she went to the tabernacle and she started praying. And Eli, or if you're in South Texas, Eli, sat at a throne at the entrance to the tabernacle. The throne. He sat at a seat. Now, whether this was typical of the high priest, or just the fact that he was just old and heavy, as they say, that generally everyone sat on the ground. They sat on these rugs around there, but no, he sat on a seat. And so it could very well be that possibly it may have been an accommodation for him because he was old and fat, or it could very well have been that over since the time of the building of the Mishkan to this time, some 300 years or so. Be more than that. It'd be a little over 300 years. Actually much more than that, almost 400 years. That they had developed to the point of the high priest having a place to sit down and adjudicate things, because that was one of his jobs, was to adjudicate cases. And so who knows? It may have been a seat of honor. It may have been just a seat of convenience. We don't know. But said Hannah stood before the tabernacle and she prayed. Now, we always get the idea of people, people getting down on their hands and knees, or bowing on their knees, with their hands like this and praying, and it's a very Christian Western concept of prayer. For the most part, Jews would stand and pray, but in this case, I'm not sure that, Hannah was so broken that she possibly just couldn't stand from the whole agony of all of this, the angst that she felt about not having a child, that she would be possibly just bowed down before that. But then again, she might not have. It's a lot of how we do things nowadays is a little bit different because I mean, Jews stand when we pray, Christians kneel or sit down when they pray. Um, we pray with our heads covered. The Christians pray with their heads uncovered. So it's, I think part of it was, okay, whatever you Jews are going to do, we're going to do it different. And that's kind of the way they did it. All right, let's go ahead because I'm not going to finish this by 8 o'clock. So she made a vow and said, Adonai's vow, if you will indeed look upon the affliction of your handmaid, remember me and not forget your handmaid, but grant your handmaid a son, then I will give him to Adonai all the days of his life, and no razor will ever touch his head. Came to pass as she prayed long before Adonai that Eli was watching her mouth. Now Hannah was praying in her heart. Only her lips were moving, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Okay, generally when people prayed, they would pray out loud. Okay, but Hannah was praying silently, and the only thing that her lips were moving, maybe her eyes were closed. She was just calling out to God from her heart. She was not sitting there with a siddur and going through prayers and doing the davening, that sort of thing. No, she was crying out from her heart, and Eli was looking at that and thought, oh, that she was drunk. Now, why in the world would he think that she was drunk? Okay, we'll talk about it in a minute. Okay, now just background: a Levite generally served from the age of 25 to 50, and they served as in the temple, in the tabernacle, from that time frame. Hannah, though, it appears that what she's doing, she is dedicating Samuel or whoever is going to be born to her from birth to death, his entire life. Also, she made the vow that she was dedicating um, Shmuel, as a Nazirite. She said, no razor will ever touch his head. So she's really, kind of upping the ante there. And her prayer was silent. We talked about that. Now, the the idea of the drunkenness maybe was because when people would bring those sacrifices, the fellowship sacrifices, and so on and so forth, they also were to bring in a certain amount of wine with their sacrifice. That was prescribed by Torah, that when you bring these certain sacrifices, you also bring in bread or flour and wine. And so possibly, and these fellowship offerings were supposed to be a good time. And so the idea that maybe people drank too much when they did this, I mean, like it was a 1 year, that they didn't do it that often because it was very expensive to do. And so possibly being a little tipsy was common. Who knows? Then Eli said, how long will you be drunk? Get rid of your wine. But in response, Hannah said, no, my Lord, I'm a woman with an oppressed spirit. I haven't been drinking wine or beer. Instead, I've been pouring out my soul before Adonai. Don't consider your handmaid a wicked woman, for out of my great anguish and grief I've been praying until now. Then Eli responded, go in shalom, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you ask of him. Okay, some interesting stuff there in that, Eli certainly totally misinterpreted what Hannah was doing. He's sitting there watching this woman, and she's just crying out. She's weeping and not saying anything, just her lips are moving. And so maybe it was a reflection of his own spiritual level at that time that he could not discern that this woman was really deeply distressed. And but Hannah, she didn't go fly off the handle or anything. She just responded honestly, just poured her heart out again to Eli, and said, okay, this is a story, this is what I'm doing. And and then also Eli, he didn't argue with her and says, oh no, you look drunk to me, that sort of thing. No, he was gracious, and so what did he do? He said to her that um, um, go in shalom, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant your petition that you ask of him. This is the only instance that I know of in the Tanakh where a priest, a Kohen, blesses an individual person and gives them a kind of an Aaronic benediction for one person. Uh, Generally speaking, it was a corporate thing. All right. So let's see. And may your maidservant find favor in your eyes, she said. So the woman went her way. She ate, and her countenance was no longer dejected. They rose up early in the morning and worshiped before Adonai, then went back to their home in Ramah. Then Elkanah was intimate with his wife Hannah, and Adonai remembered her. So it came to pass at the turn of the year that Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She called his name Samuel, because I have asked Adonai for him. Okay. So she must have felt in her spirit somehow that God was going to grant her request, her prayer, and so she got up from there, having been blessed by the high priest there, Eli, and went her way. She went and ate dinner. She got something to eat, and it said no longer did she look like she was distressed. So she cleaned up. You got the the vestiges of crying and weeping out and having a good meal. So she was no longer in this terrible state. They said they got up the next morning and worshiped the Lord. What happens early the next morning was the normal routine of the tabernacle, where they would offer the tamid offering. What was the tamid offering? It was a lamb, a yearling lamb, that they would offer in the morning and then one in the evening. And so they got up, and they were there for the tamid offering in the morning. And then they went on home. God remembered her, and she conceived, and she had the son Shmuel, which means asked of God. Asked of God. And so normally the names were given by the father, but in this case, the Bible says that she gave him the name. And certainly Elkanah went along with it. He probably was so happy to have a son that he said, "Yeah, Hannah, you can name him. I mean, you've been praying for this little guy for so long. You can name him." So anyway, they did. That's what they did. And going on, then when the man Elkanah and his household went up to offer the annual sacrifice to Adonai and to fulfill his vow offering, Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, "When the child is weaned, I'll bring him up, so he may appear before Adonai and stay there forever." So her husband Elkanah said to her, "Do what seems best to you. Until we have weaned him, only may Adonai establish his word." So the woman stayed home and nursed her son until she weaned him. Okay, and how long would that be? Okay, it could be a couple of years. Okay, 2 or 3 years. So we say that Samuel actually went up to start serving in the temple as a 3-year-old. And actually, that is when traditionally Jewish boys are started. Jewish children they begin their Torah education is at the age of 3. And that's when kids normally, boys, they don't get a haircut until their 3rd birthday. All right. So when was this yearly offering that they were talking about in this case? Possibly Sukkot. We really don't have any way of going. And if you'll if you read the sages, Barbanel says one thing, and Rabbi Akiva says another thing as to when they thought the events took place. Was it at Shavuot or was at Sukkot? We don't know. It's just, and there are good arguments on either side, either way. But and it says that he made a sacrifice and a sacrifice for his vow. What vow? What did he do? Possibly Elkanah also, because of his wife's prayer and her vow that she would make Samuel dedicate him to the Lord from birth to death, and that also he would be a Nazirite. It could very well be that Elkanah was either had his own vow, or he was fulfilling some kind of a sacrificial requirement because of Hannah's vow. And then so it says she didn't really go up to back up to Shiloh until after the baby was weaned. And we know that later on, some of the sacrifices that traditionally you wouldn't take a lamb and sacrifice it until it had been weaned. So so when she took him up to when she had weaned him, she took him up with her along with 3 bulls, 1 ephah of flour, and a jar of wine, and brought him to the house of Adonai in Shiloh while the child was still young. And after they slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. All right, now there's mentioned 3 bulls. Well, where does that fit in with sacrifices? Well, we really don't know. I mean, there's a lot of speculation that, okay, well, when it said they brought 3 bulls and then they sacrificed the bull. Okay, were they taking those 3 bulls and that then taking the plural down to the singular, meaning that they sacrificed all 3 bulls at the same time? Possibly so. Or could it have been that they had brought in a burnt offering bull, then they brought in a fellowship offering bull? The burnt offering was an olah. It was going to be totally burned up. A fellowship offering, they would eat of it, and then the other one possibly would be for a gift to Eli for maybe for maintenance of Shmuel, for Samuel, of bringing him into the temple. We don't really know. It doesn't really tell us. It just kind of dangles it out there. So all of that I just said, that's midrash. Okay, just don't build any doctrine on that. So I don't want to see any the first church of Samuel and the 3 bulls. So then it just they offered the sacrifice and brought Samuel to Eli. And she gets up there and says, "It's me, my Lord." She says, "As your soul lives, my Lord, I'm the woman that stood by you here praying to Adonai. For this boy I prayed, and Adonai has granted me my petition that I ask of him. And so I, in return, dedicate him to Adonai. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to Adonai." Then he bowed in worship there before Adonai. Okay, so here he is. He's saying, why would it say, it is me, it's me, my Lord, the high priest there says, "Don't you remember? I'm the one." And of course, by this time, this was going to be 3 to 4 years later, because the time that he said, "Yeah, go," and then by the time she got pregnant and had the baby and so forth, so it could have been 3 to 4 years. And there's been lots of people going through that Mishkan in that 3 to 4 years. So possibly didn't understand her or didn't remember her. And so she reminded him of the circumstances there where I was sitting there and I did, I was praying and so forth. So But basically, I just wanted to bring in the idea that this dedication, they brought the baby down there and they dedicated him to Adonai. This was a big deal. Bringing 3 bulls in, very, very, very expensive. That's that would have been the equivalent of several, months and months, if not years of salary to sacrifice 3 bulls. But they brought him in and they gave him to the Lord. They dedicated this child to the Lord. And in certain churches, they will have what they call baby dedication. We did that for our children, that dedicate them to the Lord. But it's not intended that you would dedicate them to a deal where, okay, we're gonna give you away to the pastor of the first church of Samuel and the 3 bulls. No, you dedicate your child just symbolically that whatever happens to them, Lord, they're yours. And sometimes that's good, because later on, when they become teenagers, you got to say, hey, Lord, you remember we dedicated them to you. They're yours. Do something with them. And maybe y'all never had to do that with your teenagers, but maybe I wasn't that good at raising teenagers. But I do know that grandchildren are the reward that God gives you for not strangling your teenagers. Just thought I'd bring that out. All right. But that was a very, very, very big deal and quite a sacrifice for Hannah and Elkanah. And then, of course, they would see the child 3 times a year when they came down to Shiloh for the Shiloh for the various for the 3 festivals each year. All right, and that concludes what I've got for tonight. Now, are there any